Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Greg never had the habit of being suspicious. He'd always been the kind of person who preferred to believe in stability, in the comfort of repetition, in the safety of a routine carefully built over decades. To him, every step he'd taken with Linda had been like laying a foundation. Their first kiss in their 20s, the birth of their first child, buying the house, starting over after financial setbacks, celebrating wedding anniversaries at home with cheap wine and frozen lasagna. Everything made sense within that consistency. That's why such a simple gesture, the way she pressed her phone's button and turned it face down the moment he walked in, planted something in him he never thought he'd actually feel: doubt. She said, "Hi, honey," smiled like always, kissed him on the cheek, and went into the kitchen. But there was a strange delay in that smile. Like it had been calculated. Like it was a rehearsed response to a mistake she knew she'd made. Greg stood still for a few seconds, staring at the spot where she'd just been. An emptiness that was both physical and symbolic. And no matter how hard he tried to dismiss it as paranoia or overthinking, something inside him screamed. It wasn't just jealousy. It was something different, almost like an alarm going off in a part of him he'd never had to visit before. In the days that followed, he tried to let it go. He stuck to his routine, made breakfast, went to work, had lunch with coworkers, came home, watched an episode of the show they were following. But there was an invisible crack now between him and Linda. A tension masked by small silences, by hugs that felt shorter, by glances he believed were being avoided. And the more he tried to pretend everything was the same, the deeper he sank into this unease that would hit him at random moments, while driving, washing dishes, or hearing the sound of a notification on her phone. One night, lying beside Linda pretending to sleep, he listened to the soft taps on her phone. He tried to guess if it was a group chat with friends, a message from her sister, or something more. It became routine. When he woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, he'd check if her phone was nearby. Once, he even picked it up while she was asleep, but it was locked with facial recognition. He put it back immediately, feeling both stupid and guilty. But what ate at him wasn't just the possibility of physical betrayal. It was the idea that he might be being deceived without even knowing. That something was happening beyond his sight, and all the effort of 24 years could be slipping away without him noticing. Greg wasn't the type to fall for conspiracy theories. He never believed in hidden messages or signs from fate. But this discomfort started to feel almost physical. His stomach tightened when she got a call in the middle of the afternoon. He noticed how she smiled when replying to messages, and if that smile lasted more than 2 seconds, his mind would instantly build a whole story around it. Linda started to notice he was quieter, that he seemed troubled, but she didn't say anything. He, in turn, brushed it off, saying it was work, that he was tired, that the company had been demanding more than usual. A convenient lie to avoid confrontation. Once, during lunch in the company cafeteria, Greg noticed a coworker reading an article about relationships. The title read, "10 Signs Your Partner Might Be Cheating Without You Knowing." He chuckled quietly, but later that afternoon, while drinking coffee alone, he typed the same title into his phone and read every listed sign. One by one. And as he read, it felt like each point fit with disturbing precision into the new version of Linda his mind had created. Sudden behavior changes, overprotectiveness with the phone, evasive answers, inappropriate smiles. It all made sense, or at least it seemed to make sense when his mind was already consumed by suspicion. Greg didn't want change. He never did. He always believed that maintaining order was better than risking the unknown. When the kids suggested selling the house and moving to a smaller place, he resisted. When Linda proposed taking dance classes to break the routine, he pretended to be interested but never went. When she started going out more with her friends on Tuesday nights, he accepted without questioning, but now those outings began to weigh on him like evidence. He started assembling a puzzle with pieces that might not even belong to the same picture. A compliment she'd received from a stranger months ago, which she'd responded to with a smile. A good morning message from a friend with too many emojis. The trip she suggested for the end of the year, to a place where an old flame of hers lived. Everything turned into a hypothesis, a possibility. Greg's mind became a silent courtroom where every one of her gestures was a witness to be questioned. Even without proof, he already felt betrayed. He was already tasting the bitterness of suspicion as if it were real. And the strangest part was that part of him seemed to want to find something. As if the truth, no matter how painful, was still better than this corrosive doubt eating away at his thoughts. And that was exactly what he began planning, how to uncover the truth with the few resources he had. Because by then, it wasn't just about whether Linda was cheating. It was about confirming whether he was still the man she'd choose again, even after all these years. Greg decided to act when he realized the questions in his head were leaving no room for silence. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, or how he'd find a concrete answer. But one certainty drove him: he needed to confirm what his instincts were telling him before it consumed him from the inside. One ordinary afternoon, while washing dinner dishes, he heard Linda tell their daughter that Tuesday would be card club night at Sharon's house. She mentioned the name casually, like it was part of everyday life, and explained it was a kind of gathering with neighborhood friends, something informal but regular. Greg didn't pay much attention to the conversation itself, but he mentally noted it as if he'd discovered a clue. That would be his starting point. The following Tuesday, he left work a little early, telling his supervisor he needed to take the car in for a service. He drove home, parked across the street, and waited. He watched for a few minutes until he saw Linda come out with a bag. She got into her car and drove off. Greg turned on the engine and followed at a safe distance, driven by a mix of adrenaline and nervousness that felt new to him. He'd never followed anyone before, much less the woman he'd built a life with. During the drive, he imagined what he might find. He pictured her meeting someone mysterious, getting into another car, or making excuses to hide some other activity. When she parked in front of Sharon's house, Greg stayed a little farther back. He saw her ring the doorbell and get greeted with a hug from a blonde woman. Minutes later, other women started arriving. Some on foot, others by car. He mentally noted their faces and clothing, looking for anything unusual. No clues appeared. After about half an hour, there were 8 women inside. He heard laughter, loud conversations, background music, and sometimes the sound of shuffling cards. He tried to see through the window, but the curtains blocked any clear view. He pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and zoomed in, but all he got was a blurry image of women sitting in a circle, holding glasses, with snacks on the table. He waited almost 2 hours for something to change. His stomach growled. The air in the car felt stuffy. He considered giving up, but he felt he needed to push a little longer. By then, the physical discomfort was less intense than the mental unease. At any moment, something different could happen. But nothing did. When he finally saw Linda saying goodbye with a group hug and getting back into her car, Greg turned on the engine and quietly slipped away down a side street, unnoticed. On the way home, he stopped at a gas station to use the bathroom. As he stepped out of the car, he stepped on something soft and slippery. Dog poop. He cleaned it as best he could with a water bottle he found in the trunk and got back in the car, still smelling it on his shoe. This mission, which was supposed to bring him some revelation, had turned into a series of frustrations. When he got home, he acted normal. Linda was already in the shower. The kids were watching TV. Greg went straight to the bedroom, took off his shoes, and left them outside the door. He crawled under the blanket and stared at the ceiling. His mind was racing. Nothing he'd seen seemed to confirm any suspicion. But still, something inside him insisted there was still one missing piece. The feeling of being deceived didn't fade easily. It was like a fog covering logic, even in the absence of proof. He tried to sleep, but his mind kept asking questions he was already tired of repeating. He wondered how long this might have been going on if he was actually right. He tried to remember if Linda had changed her perfume, or if she wore fancier clothes on Tuesdays. He even questioned whether she smiled differently after coming back from those gatherings. The next morning, while Linda left with their youngest child, he opened drawers, went through tissue boxes, checked clothing tags, looked between books. He found only what had always been there: folded sweaters, old documents, paid bills, a photo of the two of them from a trip 5 years ago. Then he went to the laundry room and inspected the dirty clothes. He separated her clothes and ran his fingers over the fabrics with a care bordering on obsession. He looked for unfamiliar scents, stains, marks. At one point, he held a pair of underwear in his hands as if it were decisive evidence. He examined it for seconds and, again, found nothing. Just the plain, mystery-free reality. He felt anger, toward himself, toward the situation, toward the emptiness he was creating around something that might just be a product of his imagination. He opened the laptop. He searched through the shared email account they used for shopping and banking documents. He checked the trash, the message history. He found an expired clothing store coupon, a message exchange with her aunt about a cheesecake recipe, and a chat with a neighbor about sidewalk repairs. He read every line as if there were a secret code behind it. But everything still looked normal. He searched keywords like meeting, man, love, lie. The results only reinforced his defeat: cake recipes, medication instructions, school reports. He slammed the laptop shut harder than he meant to. By the end of that morning, sitting on the edge of the bed, Greg felt like he was losing something important. It wasn't just time. It was control over his own sanity. It was like he was digging an endless hole, trying to find something that would justify the knot in his chest. But all he found was the echo of his own emptiness, amplified by a suspicion that seemed harder and harder to explain. And still, his mind kept feeding the idea that maybe he was just looking in the wrong place. That the truth he needed was still hidden somewhere in the routine that once felt so familiar. Greg had already searched everything he could: wardrobe, emails, purse, even her phone when she left it on the sink while showering. Only one place remained that still seemed promising: the laundry basket in the laundry room. That pile of intimate clothes had become, for him, a kind of living archive. The last possible trace of a mistake, of a slip-up. All morning Saturday, he went through ordinary tasks, fixing the backyard faucet, buying bread, changing light bulbs, but his mind had already decided what he'd do once the house was quiet. When Linda left again, this time with their daughter to buy school supplies, Greg walked straight to the laundry room. He stopped in front of the basket and took a deep breath. He pulled out the clothes one by one. First the socks, then the t-shirts, finally the underwear. He carefully separated Linda's clothes, folding the others back. He examined each pair of underwear as if handling crime scene evidence. He felt ashamed, but ignored it. He was determined to find any sign that could confirm his theory, no matter how unlikely it seemed. He even sniffed some pieces, trying to detect unfamiliar scents. He looked for marks, strands of hair, any clue that didn't belong to their routine. He was so absorbed in his search that he didn't hear the garage door open. When he looked up, Linda was already standing in the laundry room doorway, holding a paper bag with a notebook inside. She was watching in silence. Greg, kneeling, holding 2 pairs of underwear, froze. The scene was pathetic. He tried to drop everything quickly, but the gesture only made it worse. Linda kept watching, not saying a word, and he felt his throat go dry. He wanted to explain, but the words seemed useless. She set the bag on the floor and crossed her arms. Her face didn't show anger. There was confusion, a hint of sadness, but mostly an effort to understand what she was seeing. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost disappointed. "What exactly do you think you're going to find in there?" Greg stammered. He tried to mumble an excuse, but she cut him off. "It's because of that phone call the other day, isn't it? The one I hung up when you walked in." He lowered his eyes. Linda took a deep breath, stepped closer, and with a small smile that mixed pity and affection, said, "It was your mom, Greg. She calls me every day at the same time. I only hung up because I thought you'd get annoyed again." Greg felt the ground vanish beneath him. A mix of shame, relief, and stupidity washed over him. The pieces finally clicked, but not in the way he expected. The problem wasn't Linda. It was him, his self-made stories, his judgments without evidence, the hours he'd spent feeding a fear instead of talking to her. Linda crouched down, picked up one of the items from the floor, placed it back in the basket, and looked him in the eyes. "I've never given you a reason for this. And still, you turned me into someone I'm not." He tried to justify himself, saying it wasn't from lack of love, but fear of losing everything they'd built. She just nodded, understanding more than any excuse could explain. "I saw the articles you've been reading on your phone. How to tell if your wife is cheating. Signs of silent infidelity. Were you testing me, Greg?" He felt a knot in his chest. It was true. And she knew everything. "I've felt watched these past few days, and now I understand why. Did you follow me?" Greg stayed silent. The guilt was so heavy that any answer would feel inadequate. Linda stood up, walked to the laundry room door, and turned before leaving. "You want to know if I still love you?" "I do. But what you're doing right now could destroy us." In silence, he gathered everything he'd scattered and sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for the day to end, hoping this was just the lowest point, not the end. Hours later, Linda returned to the bedroom. It was night. She'd changed clothes and brought 2 wine glasses. She handed one to Greg without saying a word. She sat beside him and rested her head on his shoulder. "Promise me one thing. If you feel afraid of me again, just talk." He nodded slightly. She took his hand and led him to their bedroom. That room, once just routine, now carried a new meaning. Through quiet caresses and silent reunions, Greg realized he was receiving more than he deserved. Linda didn't want to punish him. She didn't humiliate him. She didn't threaten. She chose to love, even when he was overwhelmed by ghosts that existed only in his mind. It was in that long, intimate gaze that Greg felt the weight of guilt slowly dissolve. Linda didn't say everything was okay. But she made it clear they were still together. And that was more than he'd hoped for at that moment. Greg woke up before the alarm. The room was still quiet, but inside him there was a new kind of noise. Not anxiety, not distress. It was a kind of uncomfortable calm, as if his whole body was processing the shame of the past few days while also trying to absorb the unexpected forgiveness he'd received. He sat on the bed and looked at Linda sleeping. She slept like always, one hand under the pillow, her face partly covered by the sheet. She was the same woman he'd chosen when they were too young to understand life, the same one with whom he'd raised children, overcome debts, buried parents, and celebrated birthdays at home with supermarket cake. And even after all that, he had projected his fear of being replaced onto her. He got up quietly and went to the kitchen. He made coffee without focusing on anything. The motions came automatically, but his mind wandered through memories. He remembered the first time they'd slept together. He remembered when Linda lost her father and he held her hand at the funeral without letting go for hours. He remembered when she gave birth to their second child and said, exhausted, that she didn't know if she could handle another pregnancy. And yet she had 2 more. He remembered when she cried quietly in the bathroom because she was tired, overwhelmed, and he only noticed because he found a damp tissue in the trash. All those years, Linda never turned away. She never gave up. Even when he was distant. Even when he stayed silent out of pride instead of speaking from love. And now, after everything that had happened, she chose to look at him with tenderness. Not to erase the mistake, but to say, through her actions, that this didn't have to be the end. It was as if she'd offered him a second chance without demanding anything in return. She just wanted him to trust again. Greg took his coffee cup out to the garden and sat, watching life around him, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about what might have happened if she'd reacted differently. If she'd yelled, if she'd left the house, if she'd told the kids or her friends everything. He thought about how his image would have been reduced to that of a weak, insecure, obsessed man. And maybe he was, for a few days. But what saved their marriage was something he hadn't expected: Linda's emotional maturity. The wisdom she carried inside, stronger than any speech. Before leaving for work, he wrote a short note. He took a page from his kid's notebook, tore off a strip, and left it on the living room table. "Sorry for doubting you. And thank you for loving me even when I was an idiot." He folded the paper and placed it beside the mug she always used in the morning. He didn't expect a reply. He just wanted her to know he finally understood how much he'd nearly lost. On his way to work, Greg reflected on the choices he'd made. How a single assumption, a misinterpreted moment, had been enough to build a castle of suspicions. And how he'd fed it without having a single honest conversation with the person who deserved his trust the most. The human mind, he thought, can turn fear into certainty. And imagined pain, when left unchecked, can become more destructive than real pain. Because it creates monsters that don't exist. And those monsters have the power to destroy homes, relationships, entire lives. At lunch, he mentioned the weekend to a coworker. He kept it vague, said they'd had an important talk and were doing better now. The coworker, distracted by his phone, replied, "That's just how it is, every marriage has its phases." Greg pretended to agree. He couldn't explain what really happened. It was too personal, too vulnerable. It was the kind of thing few would understand, especially men his age. Most would have responded with jokes or advice like, "Put a tracker on her car," or "Hire a detective." But he knew that path would have led him to an even darker hole. When he got home, he found the dinner table set. Linda was in the kitchen, finishing the pasta sauce. He walked up behind her and hugged her without saying a word. She just turned her face and smiled. Neither needed grand declarations. The gesture was enough. Later, while the kids finished their homework and the house settled into its usual quiet, Greg went to the living room, sat beside Linda on the couch, and said something simple, something he hadn't said in months: "I like our life." She turned her head, rested it on his shoulder, and replied, "Me too." There was no background music. No fireworks. No grand promises. What there was a silent understanding between two adults who allowed themselves to make mistakes, to feel fear, but above all, to keep going. Sometimes, the greatest challenge in a long-term relationship is exactly this: walking through the minefield of insecurities, fantasies, and unrealistic expectations, and coming out the other side hand in hand, even if wounded, but willing to try again. Greg learned this the hard way, not through the scream of a breakup, but through the whisper of forgiveness. And that's why, that night, as he turned off the bedroom lights and felt Linda rest her foot against his under the covers, he understood that real love isn't made only of perfect moments. It's also made of rebuilding, humility, and the courage to look inward before pointing outward. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.